dive in. So this talk is really geared for those that are doing adversarial testing. You might be actually doing some level of research, product research, and doing some exploit dev work. And with the solicitation of trying to consider maybe a threat model as a blueprint. So that's kind of the backdrop. Now, some people might be in here interested in some threat modeling activities and me talking about PASTA, which is a risk-centric methodology that was developed in 2015. There's going to be a lot of mentioning of that and stuff like that. But just to kind of level set, what is this talk about? This talk is really about building a risk-centric threat model so that you can do adversarial testing. And we're going to go through 2 case studies about how incident data or post-mortem attack data or events can actually help to further build out your overall application threat model, and how those threat models can serve as a blueprint for adversarial testing. I deliberately don't have more of an about me slide because I just want to dig in, and out of respect to everyone here, I just want to go ahead and cover some of the topics so that we can have more of a Q&A session. I do have a kind of about me slide at the end. But here's the overall overview. If you're not familiar with PASTA, you'll hear me say that a lot, and it's not because yesterday was International PASTA Day. That's an actual fact. So PASTA is an acronym that stands for Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. Developed in 2015 with me and an SVP from Citigroup in London, who was also an OWASP fellow. We wrote this book because we wanted to prove to stakeholders in enterprises that their products had a problem. So we wanted to prove that there was a smoking gun. And PASTA as a methodology, it is a methodology. It is follow a linear process of 7 stages. Each stage has activities that you do. You can make it very modular, just like GitLab has. If you're interested in PASTA, you can keyword search, threat modeling, PASTA, GitLab, and then they write a lot of why they adopted it, how they've made it modular, etc. But overall, we're going to focus our conversation today around stages 4 largely. And actually, let me, I know this is kind of a busy slide, but stage 4 is what I consider one of the most important parts of overall threat modeling. As the name implies, you are building a model of threats. So if you use any approach or methodology, you have to ask yourself, okay, how did I come about with the threats? Why do I think that this is a threat? And is it a threat or is it an attack? Is it a threat or is it a vulnerability? Is it a threat or is it a weakness? And in our industry, we oftentimes have these terms as synonyms, which is unfortunate. But there is an order and a hierarchy that goes actually really well with some of the taxonomies that are out there from MITRE. If you're familiar with like defend, right, or engage. Obviously, we're very familiar with like CVEs and CAPEX and the attack framework and things like that. But the idea here is that we want to substantiate our reason for attacking something. Now, for those of you that just came in, this talk is really meant for those that are thinking adversarially about doing some product testing. And we'll talk about generic forms of exploit dev, exploit testing, pen testing, and then targeted, right? That has some sort of objective in mind. This is where a threat model is really, really good. We're going to go through 2 case studies, and we're going to talk about how the importance. So again, we'll focus a lot on stage 4, which is the building a model of threats. How do we leverage security events and incidents, things that have happened in the news? Of course, everyone's heard of what's going on with Okta, right? And the ripple effects to other organizations impacted by Okta, even security organizations. What does that mean in terms of an overall application threat model for maybe a product that you're testing or a product that you're using? The inherent problem, let me take away my laser pointer. The inherent problem that we have with most threat models is that they're not being fed by something, right? So when most people, let's take banking for example. I don't know if there's any banking FI representatives in here, but right now regulation, compliance is always like years behind, but they are introducing the words like, what are you doing about threat modeling? So you have actual auditors. I didn't deliberately try to look like one today, but I mean, I am wearing a suit. But they are asking the question, are you doing any threat modeling? And that's great, for someone that is interested in threat modeling. But as you know, with compliance and auditors, it's like, oh, you are, check, right? And that's it. What we want to do as true security practitioners is to substantiate what are some of the adversarial reasons that we want to attack a product or an application or infrastructure. So we're going to go through 2 case studies today. One is in the consumer market in a consumer electronic device, and the other one is a provider of WellSpot WellSpot monitoring. We're close to Houston, so some of this terminology might be familiar for those in the oil sector. But there is a party that basically invented a SaaS product to measure the output of well spots in the oil and the petro business. But again, the inherent problems, you have 3 key ones there, is that you have a lot of infrastructure in environments that are giving off alarms, right? And you have SOC analysts that are eyes on glass, they're triaging what comes out of their SIM, what comes out of their SOAR, but they're not feeding it back into a threat model. It just gets focused on post-event remediation or mitigation or response. And that's it, that's where it dies. Pasta is asking and saying, as a methodology for threat modeling, saying, let's take those events, let's take those incidents. Does it substantiate our overall threat model for our flagship applications, for our internal applications, for our overall organization? So the idea is to look at, in the book that was published in 2015, there's 2 terminologies that was referenced: threat data and threat intel. And you all might have synonyms of what this stuff means, right? But threat intel, for us in the book, contextually just means that what is all the advisory groups saying? Like, what does CISA say about more about the industry, or what is FS-ISAC or IT ISAC or retail ISAC saying about what's affecting my industry? Threat data is really meant to be talking about what is your application environment giving off in terms of logs, in terms of at the virtual host level. What about at the WAF level? What about at the network level, right? And does that really tie back into an overall threat model? And from a defensive standpoint, true story, I actually transitioned from IT into security as my first job as a security person was a SOC analyst. So I was much like this person right here, looking at events, and we didn't have the sophistication of great correlation engines that we do today in 2023. This was in 2004, so many of you may have not even been born, but it was a lot of poor correlation, a lot of data, and so in the words of the former CEO at Symantec, he said in 2007, he said, we have a content problem in security, right? We have a lot of data that's overwhelming operations, and we still have this problem, right? We have even a lot more tools and solutions that are associated with our virtualized or cloud environments and things like that. How do we make it contextual when we want to do threat modeling? Or how do we leverage it into threat modeling so it can serve as a blueprint for how we're going to attack a product or an application as part of a pen test, or maybe as part of a research exploit dev effort? So there's a lot of data out there, and this simple funnel represents from left to right the problem. Right now, again, let's fast forward to 2023. Let's take something like Splunk or QRadar or Sumo Logic, whatever you're using to aggregate SIMs, and let's say you have perfect data telemetry. This information is important to substantiate a threat model. If your threat model says, I'm concerned about account takeovers, I'm concerned about privilege escalation attacks or persistence in my environment, right? I'm concerned about persistence. So your alerts and your incidents that are happening within your infrastructure might give credence to that. You may have defined that threat library based upon different types of advisories that have been happening, and that's fine. So you get that from the threat intel. But the threat data is oftentimes ignored. There's no, and I have some threat modeling experts in the room here as well. Feel free to throw maybe a barbecue sandwich at me, tangy please. That if I'm wrong here, but no other threat modeling methodology that says let's look at threat events or incidents and feedback into our model. And so it's an opportunity. It's a lost opportunity. As a former SOC analyst myself, it just kind of dies on the vine. And once it's remediated and triaged, and it's worthless data. And there's an opportunity to leverage it. I was really sad when MITRE Does anyone recognize the STIX framework? A show of hands. And that's okay if you don't. I see some nodding of the heads here. STIX was a great, in my opinion, invention that came out of MITRE. It was since adopted by Oasis. It's still alive and well. It was used by a lot of different groups. IBM, X-Force used a lot of, there's a lot of products that are based off of STIX. Once upon a time, so STIX came out in all of its glory. It's a structured threat information exchange for the purposes of let's share intel. Okay, and then it came about, out of that came taxi services, right? Basically these services that, again, exchange threat intel information. What does this have to do with this talk? What does this have to do with threat modeling? What does this have to do with pen testing? Well, it's about being able to leverage a framework to harvest and mine good threat data or threat intel to give credence to the model of threats you're building for your application. It doesn't matter if you're in healthcare or insurance or energy, you can build an application threat model for it and substantiate your threat library with threat intel or threat data. STIX provides, you can take any one of these domains here, and we'll go over some, so I'm not gonna harp too much on this particular slide, but there's a lot of great, you see the incident domain there with the bomb on it? It's that under the incident domain, you have a schema of values that basically is looking, give me incident data that might correlate to your flagship application, maybe your SaaS-based authentication authorization application like Okta. So you want to be able to establish some level of credence with your overall threat library with things that are happening in the industry, threat data, threat intel, and threat data. Typically, now let me switch gears here, and I might seem like a total spaz, just kind of flipping in the mindset of like a pen tester and a SOC analyst and things like that. But now I'm thinking more nefariously in terms of like attacking an application. Most times when you're doing pen testing, the target of what you're researching to exploit or to see if there's something vulnerable will dictate your next steps. You'll look at things like, what sort of versions, what protocols is being used, what framework is embedded into the product to see if there's associations on vulnerabilities and see if then you can exploit that. This is the basics, right? This is the basics of some adversarial, pen testing and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that. And from a criminal standpoint, that happens all the time in terms of generalists that are trying to map what's in your attack surface to what exploits they might have, right? So there is an attack surface mapping to exploits in the wild, and they might be interested in leveraging those exploits for different types of threat motives that are non-specific. Specific ones, however, and we'll go into some case studies here just to kind of exemplify that. We're going to go into 2 case studies to exemplify more specific interest about how, going back to this slide, how does your attack surface and threat data, logs or events that are happening around your attack surface, how does that help to establish some level of credence to a threat library that you might develop for your application? If you've never done threat modeling before, a lot of people, say that threat modeling takes a lot of time, and they might be right in their own experiences. But you should, after just a couple of minutes, really develop a threat library against an application. So if you think about let's take this particular case. So here's a consumer electronic. This is a real world case study of a company called Cloud Pets. And Cloud Pets was owned by another company. But in the world of consumer electronics, right? Especially when there is some level of personal information that is a part of the consumer electronic through registrations of the consumer electronic. One threat in your threat library as an owner of that consumer manufacturing company is I want to steal the consumer data. Okay, so that's one threat in the threat library. We could stop there and we can map that out to what attacks would support that threat. What vulnerabilities would support those attacks? What countermeasures do I want to mitigate those vulnerabilities, right? And you start to see this relationship model build out. But let's look at Cloud Pets, and this is an actual event. So let's assume that we all are in the consumer electronic manufacturing business. Now, this particular company, it's they developed. There's a couple of people that have similar hair colors myself, grays out there. So you guys remember Teddy Ruxpin back in the? Okay, good. Laughters of affirmation. So back then there was a Teddy that would talk. You put a cassette tape, into the back of it. It would tell you a story, and it would freak you out by moving its eyes and moving its mouth. Imagine that, but now with an IoT component. There's an IoT component into this toy. It interfaces with a mobile device. Naturally, there's a cloud infrastructure. There's APIs that are brokering all of the use cases, right? Some of those use cases are mommy and daddy are traveling, much like me, and they want to read you a bedtime story from Austin, Texas, right? And they want to narrate some sort of like childhood fable or whatever. And these are some of the use cases. There's one of many. I'm not going to go through them all, but why am I talking about use cases? Because as we think about possible threats, in Pasta, the idea is that we want to have threats that negate your objectives as a business or a product owner. And that's why it's called risk-centric threat modeling, right? Because if I have a threat that really undermines what your objective is as a go-to-market strategist for a consumer electronic company, you're going to be like, okay, I care about that because that's going to affect things like market value or class action lawsuits for privacy violations and things like that. So it's an opportunity to map threats to objectives, right? In Pasta, we identified those objectives in stage one. Now, I did say that this is a real-life case scenario, so this was actually a breach. It was an incident here. Stage two of Pasta talks about, well, what are the components of my overall solution? There's IoT components. Those IoT components are using protocols and frameworks. There's versions of those frameworks. The back end was a MongoDB database. There was some open source components related to Bluetooth integration, and basically transferring content from the mobile device to the speaking bear, which had the embedded IoT component. So with that near field communication, now there's a use case. What is the abuse case? But from a pen testing standpoint, it's like, oh, cool, yeah, NFC communication. Maybe I could do a relay attack, and I can break some sort of level of simple authentication between the teddy bear and a rogue mobile device. But you have to reconcile that to a threat motive. Is that a threat that's actually the business is going to care about? Any type of criminal-based threat has to have widespread repercussions. It's almost like the difference between reflective cross-site scripting and persistent cross-site scripting. Reflective is just one, and then stored persistent is going to be for the masses, right? Reflected to everyone who might be in that database. So in looking at the attack surface, when we think about logs and event data, what types of logs and events are maybe affecting the components within your infrastructure? This particular product, again, had a backend MongoDB that was receiving, and here is the actual, kind of see it on the far right there, a little bit of the schema. And if you look, a little bit of the actual, so this was the actual CloudPet staging environment that, unfortunately, like most staging environments, it violated the kind of the cardinal rules that thou shalt not have production data. And so there was user tables in there, right? User data objects, and that were simply dumped. And it was a PI nightmare. And it costs the company a lot of bad face time. Going back to our threat library, when we're developing applications or components, today's software development world in major enterprises, software development is very fractured. You have a back-end team, you have a front-end team, you have an IoT team. It's very fractured. So if you're building out application threat models, you can build it for the component that you are at, and then see if you have either threat intel or threat data that is maybe saying that, hey, you know what, I'm going through a brute force attack or an illicit Mongo database access from a place I shouldn't be getting these types of requests from. Overall, the fast forward, the end story here is that this particular product has a lot of use cases at the consumer electronic level, the embedded level, the mobile API level, and all of this, the technology supports different use cases. When pen testing, you can start to think about what sort of adversarial techniques do you want to use that map back to your threat library? And does that threat library get substantiated by threat data or threat intel that's actually substantiating the reason that you have that as a threat in your threat library? For consumer electronics, so let's think about what would be a good threat library. Well, for here, this particular device, I think I had it in one of the prior slides where I said, okay, what are some of the, if we look at some of the use cases, and we're thinking about like pen testing this, what are some of the abuse cases that we would want to do? What actually happened here in the news was that in addition to the database being breached, there were some other components that were vulnerable, and there was like rogue actors that were telling little Johnny, a horror story, right? And sometimes we see this with like baby monitoring devices in the news. We see this in like the nightly news where it's like we hear like some random person telling the baby to go F off and shut their mouth or whatever when they're trying to sleep. It's something like that. A lot of the hackers might just be interested in doing this just for the lulz, right? Just to terrorize some sort of child, and they kind of get off on that. But what happens if it's more of a sophisticated type of threat motive? What happens if it's PII compromise? Or what happens if it's persistence in the web API environment that's in the cloud, and they just want to persist there and stay rent-free in that infrastructure? You have to be able to build a threat library that is substantiated by threat data or threat intel that is stemming from either information that is alerting from your infrastructure or threat intel that's coming from different industries. Let's take it back to Styx. So Styx has an opportunity, to do that. How do you get started, right? This is one of the domains in Styx. It's TTPs that we're very familiar with in terms of looking at tactics from threat actors. And there's an opportunity. The whole point of this talk is how can I build a threat model that can serve as a blueprint for attacking better? Or if I attack better, it can substantiate why I'm attacking the product in this way. So in looking at TTPs that are typically substantiated by some threat intel, you can tie that to just simply one branch of infrastructure and say, okay, well, are those TTPs really hitting parts of my consumer pet electronic infrastructure that might be vulnerable because I'm using a vulnerable web framework? Or maybe I'm using a vulnerable GATT protocol with my IoT device. But I mean, there's the MongoDB. So here, there's in the schema of TTPs in Styx, there's things like what is the actual exploit? What is the exploit target? You have the opportunity when you're doing threat modeling to build a library of exploits. What are the possible exploits that are associated with maybe my attack surface that are on the infrastructure side? With the exploit target, we're talking about the MongoDB database as one target example. That particular MongoDB had a misconfiguration. And so when you're building out a blueprint, you can have a blueprint of things that you build out as part of your threat model, and you can say, here, pen tester, you can go ahead and do your generic types of OWASP top 10s and other types of assurance lists that you want to make sure is covered. But here's a blueprint of what I want you to do. I want you to try to do some form of injection attack where you tell this child, you tell the IoT component in the bear to say a lot of expletives, right, to the end user. This kind of spells it out more. It just takes a step back from just TTPs and looks more at some of the other areas. And let's take a look at the incident domain within Styx. This is not an advocation for you to use Styx. I mean, it's well thought out. It covers a lot, but it's just simply more of a mental exercise. Like, what incidents, if you're doing pen testing right now, and you want to think about, okay, what are the abuse cases that I want to do? Maybe there's incidents that have happened to similar products, similar types of infrastructure that would provide ideas for how you want to attack. And that's really the key point here, right? And this is not something for you to do if you're a pen tester. I wouldn't do this myself. I would say, okay, do I have a SOC team? Do I have a set of SOC analysts? I would commission them to say, I want you to be able to research, and for the past 12 to 24 months, what types of data exfiltration types of attacks or types of relay attacks for BLE, Bluetooth, that's embedded into my consumer electronic device have actually happened. Because if I'm able to exploit it in my lab, I don't know how many times you've pen tested something and you've heard someone say who's like a stakeholder or your audience say, but who's really gonna do that? Have you guys ever heard that? Yes, right? It's so annoying, right? Who's really gonna do that? Why would they do that? Well, you prove it to them. You say, well, these incidents have actually happened. I found this vulnerability. I tried this exploit. And this actually happened to the company across the street that we compete with. So now product owners and the business people are like, oh, okay, I don't want to be them. So thank you for finding this. Let's go to the next case study. So we go from consumer to more commercial. This is actually interesting. They remediated their overall issue. As you can imagine, the energy sector, it's not exactly known for their maturity of security control adoptions. But this particular case is really not about Statoil. I think they renamed themselves to something. It's a Norwegian-based oil company. They're big in Norway. They're really big worldwide. And they were using a company to help them to measure well spout production. Now, I don't know much about well spout production, but I did enough research to know that this is a type of, it's before IoT-based technologies, you'd had humans go to well spouts to be able to see how much that particular well spot was actually producing in terms of reserves that were being pulled. Building a threat library for this is a great opportunity for adversarial pen testing. We see some examples of a threat library up top, right? We see here is like, what are some traditional threats to oil and gas that predate even cyber that can still be manifested through logical types of attacks? So piracy, terrorism, insurgency, organized crime, civil protests, yada, yada, yada. So in terms of an actual modern day threat library, we see some of the things below. Tainting data, so that basically well spot production values can be unreliable. And then that particular, maybe you might be wondering, well, what would be the kind of abuse case for who would be doing this, right? If there is 4 or 5 players that have IoT components that are measuring production of a well spot, and it's a corporate sabotage type of attack where they're saying this particular provider is actually having poor integrity in terms of what they're capturing, right, locally at that well spot. But our solution has higher integrity because of ABC. That is kind of so tainting data or sabotage, a type of corporate espionage or corporate sabotage. In fact, this reminds me of I think it was the Super Bowl in LA, where this is really at the beginning of Lyft and Uber, where Lyft was actually accused of DOSing like Uber's infrastructure in order to basically get greater demands on Lyft drivers. So it's not far-fetched. And in the big world, when you're talking about multi-billion-dollar opportunities with major energy providers, the motive is definitely there. We can think about ransomware as a vehicle for the threat of extortion. One thing I haven't talked about a lot when you're building threat libraries is how do you build a good threat library? Let me give you a good recipe. You have a good threat library when you and your peers understand it, but also your CEO or your CFO. And the language that could be used is something like, I want to extort you. I want to steal your data. I want to persist in your environment. You can be in marketing, everyone understands that. But when you say, I want to do a sandbox escape, people are like, what? Then you already lost your audience, right? So you start to think about threat models to have a threat library that maps to maps to the target, that maps to the effect, associated vulnerabilities, and then what is the associated attacks that you want to use to attack those vulnerabilities. And then you can go into the last layer of a countermeasure. This particular This particular situation here, there was a company called 4subc. Oops, sorry, they're right there on the left. And one of the threats of this particular piece of infrastructure was, so the overall attack surface was multifaceted. If you look at the overall solution. And this was the actual page. You see the Statoil kind of like logo on the top left. This page is actually not accessible anymore because they've remediated some of the just poor authentication for this particular vendor. But 4subc was on the internet. They say, we just landed a big contract with Statoil, which is a great way to tell hackers, hey, come check me out. And so there was multiple different components related to the overall product. There was a IoT component on the well spot. There was YubiKey option for authentication. There was integrated Azure ADFS, authentication, etc. And so what actually happened here in this particular case was that there was it was a misconfiguration, just like the consumer electronic. You were able to get into the client tenant management page into, like in this case, Statoil, to see all of your well spots and to see the production there. So that, from a nation state standpoint, is actually really interesting, right? So this is not necessarily like, this is more like OSINT, right, as the goal. And nowadays, OSINT has to be part of the threat library. People just want to be able to spy on corporations, on infrastructure, to see what's here, because as a criminal, there's a business model to get OSINT and just to put it onto the black market and say, I have OSINT on the following types of attack surfaces that maybe a researcher or an exploit developer or a mule is interested in moving some exploits to. What I like to do is to usually draw up like a one pager where it says, okay, I built a custom threat library. I have some generic threats in there, I have some custom threats, but this allows me as a pen tester to say, what types of things do I want to do as part of my red team, or what types of things do I want to do as part of my application pen test, my exploit pen testing, so I can support and prove that my threat library has credence. At the end of the day, this doesn't really change drastically how you pen test, but it does provide some level of credibility and a blueprint, right, for what you go after versus more target focused attacks. A target focused attacks, again, is like, I found this component, it's vulnerable to this, I want to try this exploit, I'm going to try to change the open source exploit information that's out there to see if I can have success, so I can get a shell or do whatever I want to do and then do post exploitation. Normal course of action, but without the frame of why should someone care? How does this relate to a threat that the product owner might care about? So here's one of my favorite types of deliverables from threat modeling, and this does a more visual representation of what I just said. So in stage 4 of PASTA, if I just kind of fan out here for a second, attack trees are begun, and they're fed in stage 5, vulnerability analysis, in stage 6, attack modeling, and in stage 7, which is residual, it's countermeasure development. But the parent node of every attack tree is the actual threat. And we take so after we built our threat library, and we want to build out now a blueprint for attacking for our pen tester. So we can basically take every threat that we have in our threat library and say, okay, let me put that up top of the parent node. And then what is the asset or component in my overall attack surface that I want to attack? And it could be something small. Ideally, it's something that's tangible that might have some associations of vulnerabilities related to how information is cached, how maybe cryptographic controls are implemented or poorly implemented. So it goes from threat to asset that would be targeted in the threat to vulnerability, and then you might have nested vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that would depend on one another. And then you would have your overall attack pattern that would basically follow that and your row of countermeasures. If we go back to the models that we've been working with before, we see some of the items here in red. Where you have a particular asset in your attack surface. The main takeaway here that if you have assets that you pen test on a regular basis, are you leveraging like threat intel, threat data, both, to be able to substantiate your threat library in your threat model? So with this here, this is like a very simplistic kind of like you have a target organization that might have a WordPress app. There's tons of different vulnerabilities associated with WordPress. But what does the organization do? Are they in political campaigning? So we got the elections next year. So what is the threat that we want to be able to build out for that type of company, for that type of product, supporting that type of company? Maybe it's a sabotage attack, okay. So with all types of, for that threat, what types of DDoS vulnerabilities can I actually identify that are viable, right? So it's a hierarchical system that ultimately looks like this. This is a healthcare example. This came out when Dick Cheney had his pacemaker installed. There was a lot of concern about vulnerabilities in the pacemaker. So again, you have, in this particular rendition of an attack tree, you have the actual component. You have use cases related to what the component does. And then you have the actual abuse cases of what you want to do. In this case, let's say harm patient. And so how would you go about so this is the actual threat in yellow, and this is the abuse case in green. So we start to map, you see the hierarchy of threat to attack, and then how would I be able to realize my abuse case? And then you could organically create your own associated vulnerabilities at a high level. You could look at the vulnerability and weakness libraries that exist in MITRE as existing libraries. They're not always accurate, and it's a nonprofit basically, right? MITRE is largely funded by DHS and NSA, and there's still a lot of inconsistencies there, but at least it provides a referenceable thing where you can say, I'm concerned about attacks that do privilege escalation, or weaknesses that are associated with like racy conditions or some sort of injection-based attack and things like that. And then you can map your weaknesses to attack libraries or post-exploitation libraries like attack. And then start to consider how you're going to develop a library of countermeasures, maybe from ASVS from OWASP, the application verification standard, or maybe from Defend from MITRE, right? This provides a nice blueprint, and it contextualizes a lot of things. This is not meant for one person to do it either. This is meant for threat modeling is a phenomenal collaborative exercise. Most of the work that we do in security is very adversarial, right? You're non-compliant with GDPR. Your baby's ugly, it's got a injection flaw, right? Everyone hates us. So with threat modeling, it's more about integrating with understanding design, understanding use, and then mapping it to abuse, and then mapping it to contextual impact and risk. When you do that, then product owners are like, I care about this, right? Because you're affecting my go-to-market, you're affecting my legal liability, as a product owner, and things like that. Just two more slides really quick. So the problem still stands. We're very, I would say, no one's really harvesting threat intel, and let's just talk about threat intel for a second. So whether you buy recorded future or insert, provider of a threat intel, how are you operationalizing that into your overall application threat model? How are you operationalizing that in general, right? A lot of people get threat intel data because an auditor, right, says, what are you doing about, staying up to date with the latest attacks and stuff like that? Well, we use sys advisory checks and blah, blah, blah. And we get this, from, we subscribe to these different forums and blah, blah, blah. But they check off the box, but it's not operationalized into an application threat model. This is why Marco and I, when we wrote this particular book, we said, we want to give credence to a model, right, that is being fed by different operational things that are happening in an environment. Data, 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 data. And so that way you build a model that substantiates some of the threats that are put into it. So in closing, if you're interested in, so the book was published in 2015 with Wiley, which explains the pricing. So don't blame me. So, but there's a second edition that's I'm way overdue on. And it's this particular beast or cylinder block is about 700 and something pages. So you can buy it for yourself if you have trouble sleeping, or you can buy it for someone you hate for Christmas, right? If you want to just kind of like douse them with threat modeling, literature. But in all seriousness, the new book is going to be half of that. It's going to have a lot more case studies, a little bit more modern, context and applicability, and ways that you can actually implement Pasta as a threat modeling, as a threat model for your product. It doesn't matter if it's a legacy product. It doesn't matter if it's a new product or not. If you want more information, there's actually an ebook that's free. You can get it off versprite.com. Versprite, we are coming out with a community free edition, and it was just announced like 2 days ago for a Pasta-based tool. So if you're interested, everyone in the United States, everyone needs a tool, right? We're like it's like our crack. So in Europe, they're more about process, and Asia Pacific are more about process focused. But we are coming out with a community version of this tool called Fork, right? Because you eat pasta with a fork. So it might be a beta name. If you have ideas, let us know. But we're coming out with this hopefully in late November, and then but it should be a way and we're going to come out with some free industry-based threat libraries, and then you can deprecate whatever you want, add to. But this is really meant so that you can start thinking about how do I establish some level of credibility with my application threat model by injecting threat data, threat intel, inherent risk, impact values on what you care about, and stuff like that. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it. That's a great question. In fact, we actually took the CIA and we modified it to add 2 CCs at the end. So we added connectivity, and we added compliance as a threat to the business or the product. Because, if you're violating confidentiality, you could therefore, violate some level of regulatory thing, potentially. But there might be some non-confidentiality thing that still violates a compliance part. But going back to your question, so sabotage attacks. So if I want to be able to sabotage a particular, we saw that like Okta lost huge amounts of valuation the other day, huge. So anybody that plays the market is now going to maybe talk to adversarial groups that say, hey, I want to be able to move the market in this way. And that's why you might do a sabotage attack. It's really meant so that you can get financial gains, or like nation states like in China that are stealing IP, and they want to solicit their stolen IP under their own label to a competitive incumbent player in the United States. It'll be good to do a timely based sabotage attack so that they can have a PR go-to-market strategy around that attack. But
ultimately that sabotage impacts what is like when you sabotage the stealing.
Availability.
Or reputation, I guess, could be another asset. So it's like, you're harming the reputation, but if you're looking at the digital assets, you can do it in 3 ways.
Yep.
Or you can do it in several different ways.
But that way, the CIA is a great way. It makes it simple, right? Because when you look at stage 1 of Pasta, it asks you, what do you care about?
Yes.
And so there you can bring up the question, I care about the C, the I. So in energy, it's about availability, yes. Right? In banking, it's about confidentiality, right? In healthcare, or exactly. In healthcare, it could be integrity. It depends if it's like an EHR, an emergency room app, or maybe an insulin pump or something like that. The integrity of information that governs how a physician is going to be using it. But it's a good, effective way. So I definitely agree with you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Just a simple question, since you led off with energy sector.
Yep.
Any advice for them from just happening around folks?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even hear about it.
Yeah.
Any just general in-sector-based that more specific advice?
Yeah, of all the ISACs, I think that there is an energy ISAC that came about after the FS ISAC and the other ISACs, but a lot of it is just really research, and to be able to have an ops team to be able to just look at things that are happening with different players that are out there. That's how I found the Statoil case that was out there. So and some of the incidents that happen in different sectors, they're not publicly disclosed because they don't want basically egg on their face or litigation. everyone says, hey, keep relationships with the FBI and Secret Service, State Secret Service, and things like that. But the reality is, when we're working with them a lot, they're only really concerned about their cases. They're not going to open up the kimono about what's going on. So that's unfortunate. I would say, just looking at the problem with the energy sectors, you would have to go like 24 months in arrears to see incidents that have now been made publicly available for you to be able to extract some juice that is relatable to you. So I agree with you. It's tough, and it makes pulling threat intel from them to be difficult. Now, threat data is still valuable, right? And the other thing I think that you can do is simply, it's more of a sneaker net type thing where you go to these energy sector conferences and you talk to other CISOs and say, hey, what are you doing? But that's, it's getting from that experiences, getting as much information from there, because typically in those types of circles, they're more susceptible to kind of sharing, this happened, here are the causal effects of how we got popped or whatever. So it's not the most sophisticated answer, but it's also not the most advanced and mature industry either. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yes.
So you mentioned IT. Have you pulled in your performance management and ITIL service composition and synthetic user monitoring to make your pen testing more valuable? Because if you can get you're already seeing it,
right?
The business owner, their SLAs,
right,
and performance management, and then you can take those Selenium scripts, convert them over to your pen test scripts. You've already got your happy path.
Right.
That happy path represents.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. And that there's right now in the market, you see that acronym a lot, PTAS, right? Pen Test as a Service. The bug bounty companies have added it to their marketing websites and stuff like that. The reason is because right now, economically, like everyone's looking for greater economies of scale. So that ties into SLAs, that ties into, kind of showing, more of a service-oriented type of model. So I think it's a great idea.
You're already speaking the developers
yep.
and the CFO's language, because they're already, in marketing too, they're already paying for Google Analytics.
Yep.
They'll be Microsoft. So if you can attach it to their SLAs and explain that.
Right.
And that's why the OWASP API Top 10 also talks about unlimited access. So if you can basically increase the cost of their web spend.
Right. No, that's a great idea.
Because the performance and the security, in reality, they're capturing a lot of the same things.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.